A passenger car of the officer who took us with him in the collective farm passed ahead. We got out of the trucks. Ahead, at a distance of 8 kilometers, the front line flickered with illuminated rockets. The soldiers who had come out with me leaned against the hedge and took food supplies out of their rucksacks. Their faces expressed nothing. I had never been able to act indifferent in the face of danger. Nevertheless, I tried to conceal my fear. Perhaps the others, too, were unwilling to show that they were afraid. An officer returned. 2 field officers wrote down our names. Then we were divided into squads of 15 men under the command of a sergeant or an Oberf-Reiter. The officer climbed up on the seat of the car and addressed us without wasting mere words. The enemy had cut us off from the line of retreat. To outflank the enemy, we would have to turn north, into the plains where there are no roads. There we would be finished. Therefore, to take our new positions, which are already close, you will have to break the blockade. After that, you will be on the defensive until new orders. Good luck, Heil Hitler. I was about to explain that I was in the transport regiment, but I realized it was useless. We opened the ammunition boxes, distributed their contents. My pockets were filled to the brim. I got 2 grenades which I did not know how to handle. Altogether, we went to the edge of the burnt village. Some of the soldiers took care of the wounded. There was smoke from charred German vehicles. The lieutenant ordered me and 5 other soldiers to go with him. We moved down a long street that was almost unscathed. There was a whistle from a flying shell, and we threw ourselves to the ground. It exploded somewhere in the center of the village, 700 to 800 meters away from us. Shrapnel sprinkled between 2 rows of buildings. We walked for 15 minutes, sticking to the buildings. Suddenly there was a burst of gunfire. Several people emerged from the cloud of smoke. "Look out," shouted the lieutenant. We rushed to the ground, preparing to open fire, but stopped when we saw the German uniform. Other soldiers were already running to our aid. Soldiers from the squad, which we first mistook for Russians, ran closer. I saw one of them, without a rifle, holding onto his right thigh with both hands. He fell down, got up again, and fell down again. 2 others were following him. I heard a shout. "Mutter, come to me." The cry came in my own language. Then the firing resumed. Part of the party rushed for cover, but the 2 continued to run toward us in spite of the danger. They reached the door of the barn, kicked it open without difficulty, and stood in the opening cursing in French. Without thinking of the danger, I ran across the street, and like a hurricane, found myself beside them. The soldiers did not pay the slightest attention to me. "Hey," I said, grabbing one of them by the gun belt. "You're French." For a split second they stared at me in silence. Then their eyes turned to the cloud of dust and smoke billowing from the house that had just caught fire. "No, Walloon Division," said one, without turning his head. From several bursts we involuntarily bent our shoulders. "Oh, these bastards shoot us like rabbits. They don't take prisoners, the pigs." "I am French," I said with an uncertain smile. "Then beware. Volunteers don't get captured." "But I'm not a volunteer." There was more firing in the street, closer now. A roof fell 20 yards away. The lieutenant signaled a retreat. We rushed with all our legs to run the same way we had come here, pursued by machine gun fire. 2 or 3 soldiers fell to the ground screaming. We almost ran into 2 soldiers armed with a large caliber machine gun, which they stopped firing because we were blocking their view. A few made it to a street perpendicular to the one we were traveling on. All took cover behind the rubble. The lieutenant whistled again to regroup us when suddenly 2 Mark III tanks came into view. They drove up to the lieutenant, who held them up, waving his arms. After a brief conversation, the tanks went down the street from which we had just escaped, chasing the enemy. The lieutenant regrouped our ranks, and we followed the tanks, whose trek scattered the rubble that covered the streets. I ran from corners of buildings to piles of rubble, not remembering myself from fear, not knowing what I was doing, not seeing possible targets. Several times the tanks disappeared from sight, hidden by dust, sand, fire, but then reappeared. Their guns were firing continuously. Soon we reached the place from which our retreat had begun. It was an open area surrounded by peasant huts standing around a pond. The tanks drove around the pond, smashing all the obstacles. On the far side of the pond we could clearly distinguish the figures of people scattering from the tanks. We entrenched ourselves on the bank and opened fire. On our right another German company appeared and started throwing grenades into the huts. The tanks had already reached the other side of the pond and began to destroy the positions just abandoned by the enemy. At last I had an opportunity to shoot at the Russians. They were only 30 meters away. They ran out of a house blown up by our soldiers' grenades. Shots from 10 rifles rang out, and not a single Russian got up again. The fact that we were advancing, the fact that we had finally taken control of the situation, encouraged us. We had defeated a numerically superior enemy, as has always happened in Russia. It was as if we had grown wings of pride. Attackers always act with more enthusiasm than those who are on the defense. Only offensive troops are capable of a feat. Such was the case with the German army. It was organized as an offensive, and its defensive tactics was to slow down the enemy's advance with a counterattack. A few of our soldiers seized Russian weapons and immediately turned them around and started firing. Our tanks and this improvised artillery began to act in concert. The gun-fired shells captured from the Russians at carefully chosen targets. But now the tanks turned and left, leaving us to defend the area. Under the direction of the lieutenant, we took up positions and prepared for defense. There was firing all around. It began to rain heavily. The twilight was thickening. We exchanged fire with the enemy as before. The ranks of the Russians were growing. They were preparing to regain their abandoned positions. As darkness fell, the firing ceased. The lieutenant sent a soldier to get flares. To the southwest, the horizon was ablaze with bursts of artillery fire. Unsuspecting, we became participants in the Third Battle of Kharkov, the front of which stretched around the city at a distance of 800 kilometers. For our company, the battle came to an end. We heard the distant sound of machine guns coming from behind the noise of running engines. Our trucks were trying, taking advantage of the darkness, to break through the Russian blockade. And we lurked, waiting for the Russian attack. From behind appeared Volkswagen with headlights on. The driver exchanged a few words with the commander and handed 4 of our soldiers' mines. With whitened faces, they went into the darkness to place the mines on both sides of the pond. 5 minutes later, a muffled shout came from the left, and soon after only 2 soldiers returned. After waiting another half hour, we realized that the other 2 had run into the knives of the Russians. Later that night, when we were all sleepy, we witnessed a tragedy that made our blood run cold. We had thrown a few grenades blindly to prevent a possible attack, when to my left a long, shrill cry came from the crater. It sounded as if someone was desperately fighting for his life. Then there was a call for help. We jumped out of our hiding places. Several shots flashed in the darkness. Fortunately, no one was hurt. We reached the edge of the crater. The Russian, dropping his revolver, raised his hands. Down in the crater 2 more were struggling. One of them, waving a dirk, had dwarfed a soldier from our squad. 2 of them took up the Russian, who had raised his hands, and a young Oberefreiter crept into the funnel and struck his assailant on the back of the head with a spatula. The Russian immediately loosened his grip. The German with whom he was struggling jumped up. He was covered with blood. With one hand he waved the knife, and with the other he tried to stop the blood flowing from the wound. "Where is he?" shouted the wounded man furiously. "Where is that other one?" Taking a few wide steps, he approached the 2 soldiers holding the prisoner. Before we could do anything, he stuck a knife right into the stomach of the petrified from horror Russian. Thug. He roared, looking for someone else to rip open his stomach. We grabbed him so the soldier wouldn't break through our ranks. "Let me go." The soldier wouldn't stop. "I'll show these savages how to use a knife." Shut up," shouted the lieutenant, tired of dealing with a squad of who knows who. "Go back to your trenches before Ivan crushes you with machine gun fire." The disturbed man, whose bleeding wouldn't stop, was dragged to the rear by 2 soldiers. I went back to the foxhole. I had not yet had time to get used to thinking about the events of the day, and now belatedly I began to react to what had happened. Quinine, which had come and gone, had soaked our clothes and made them heavy. There was a disgusting odour coming from the pond. 2 of my foxhole neighbours snored. All through the night, which seemed never to end, I chatted with my comrades to keep from snapping. In the distance could be heard the rumbling of our trucks. Long before dawn, the enemy again went on the offensive. The flares that flashed over the positions blinded us with unexpected flashes. We looked at each other, unable to utter a word. The blinding light gave our faces an eerie expression. As dawn broke, the enemy artillery began shelling the road a quarter of a mile from us with shells of all calibers. As I ventured outside, I saw here and there the heads in helmets peeking out of the trenches, tired from the endless strain of the soldiers trying to guess what was waiting for us at the pond. I finished the last crumbs of vitaminized cookies. From sleeplessness and exhaustion, we couldn't even realize what exactly was going on. Even if a tiny detachment of Russians had shown up, we wouldn't have been able to stop them. Fortunately, the Soviets did not go on the attack. We only had to endure an hour of artillery fire. 9 men were wounded. When the sun reached its zenith, we felt better. After all, a Reich soldier had to be resilient, to withstand cold, heat, rain, pain, hunger, fear. Everything was turning over in my stomach. The blood was pounding in my temples. There was something wrong in the air, on the ground, in the world. But we were so used to everything that we tried not to notice the difficulties that befell us. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the order came to abandon our positions. This order had to be carried out with many precautions. We had a long distance to cover with all our weapons. 2 sappers followed behind and mined the way for the enemy. It was not until we reached the ruins of the first house that we were able to straighten up. Entering the hut, we began to fumble around in all corners in search of food. I remember straightening up with 3 raw potatoes. I had never eaten anything more delicious. We reached the crossroads from which our troop had set out 24 hours ago. It was still possible to recognize the 2 roads on which we had moved the day before. Now their surface had been resurfaced. In a cloud of smoke everywhere, one looked at the remains of abandoned Wehrmacht vehicles lay in the ruins of houses. Here, too, in the mud, lay by the vehicles and the corpses of Germans awaiting the funeral party. The sappers were setting fire to the trucks, blocking the passage. For a while we walked through this chaos, supporting the wounded man. 100 yards away, another detachment, outnumbering us, was retreating. Soldiers were hauling out weapons and equipment. We followed the lieutenant to a dilapidated building that used to house the officers in charge of the city's defense. Not a soul was left there. A sergeant sitting on a motorcycle was waiting in front of the building to give instructions to those who had fallen behind their squads. The lieutenant led us further west. We walked another 12 miles under threat of being captured by guerrillas, ready to open fire without hesitation. After making a 20-mile detour to avoid Russian fire, we arrived at the abandoned Luftwaffe airfield. We hoped that there was still some food in the wooden buildings, which resembled those we had occupied on the Don. Carrying 4 wounded men on stretchers made along the way, we entered one hangar, barely dragging our feet from fatigue, and froze, shocked by the horrible sight. Right at the bottom of the bunker lay a body. 2 skinny cats were nibbling on his arm. I felt sick. Shoo, shouted my travelling companion. The lieutenant, who felt no better than I did, threw a grenade. The cats scurried away, and human remains exploded into the air. If cats eat the dead, someone said, then there's no food left here. In the empty field were 2 airplanes with Maltese crosses on their wings. Perhaps they were malfunctioning. An alarming sound came from the sky, growing louder and louder. Everyone's faces turned white. We realized that we were standing near 2 planes in the middle of a huge empty field. We could hardly have been unseen. We rushed into the shelter without waiting for orders. Sprawling on the ground, we hoped to take cover from the 6 black dots approaching us. I immediately thought of the bunker where the cats were starving. 6 of my companions thought the same thing. Although I ran as fast as I could, I was the last to arrive when the bunker was already full. I looked at it with despair, hoping that a miracle would happen and the bunker would become bigger. Maybe we were mistaken and it was our planes. No. The sound of enemy planes is unrecognizable. The rumbling of the engines grew louder and louder. I threw myself on the ground, realizing that nothing would protect me now, wrapped my arms around my head and closed my eyes, trying not to notice the muffled explosions. The ground was rising upward, shaking every part of my body. I knew for sure I wouldn't survive, but the storm passed as quickly as it had started. I looked up and saw that the enemy planes had split up, gaining altitude in the pale blue sky. Soldiers were rising everywhere. From all feet they were running for better shelter. The Russian pilots had regrouped and were now pouncing on us again. Everything inside me went cold. Like a madman, I rushed to escape, even though I knew that I would not reach the road with the craters that could serve as a shelter. My feet, shod in heavy boots, stuck in the ground. In despair, ignoring the voice of reason, I threw myself on the wet grass, feeling that the planes were above us again. The ground shuddered from the bursts. I kicked. I began scrabbling on the ground like a rabbit whose last hope was to bury itself. I heard blood-chilling screams. Bright flashes broke through clenched fists and tightly closed eyes. I lay like that for only 2 or 3 minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. When at last I ventured to look up, the 2 remaining airplanes on the airfield had turned into a bonfire. The Russians had moved off into the distance to regroup before another attack. I gathered myself, got up, and with my last strength ran, now in the other direction, toward the wooden buildings that seemed a safe haven. I had travelled a third of the distance when the planes began their attack again. They struck just as the barns splintered into splinters. After a few horrible moments, we heard the distant noise of engines. All who were able rose. A silence ensued. We looked at the flames, at the sky, at the bloody human remains. The lieutenant, who seemed to have lost his mind, though he was not wounded, ran from one wounded man to another. "Shit," someone shouted. "One more attack like that and we won't have a single one left alive. They've only left us for a while. We can't get out." "Shut up," shouted the lieutenant holding the wounded man. "War is no picnic." Who did he say that to? We gathered around. He lifted the bloody soldier by the shoulders, who was laughing even though he'd been torn in two. For a second I thought he was crying in pain, but no, he was laughing. "It's the philosopher," said someone. They hadn't noticed him before, his friend explained. This philosopher always said he'd come home without a scratch. 3 of us tried to lift him to his feet, but realized it was impossible. Explosions of laughter were interrupted by words that I heard perfectly well. I remember his laughter. There was nothing abnormal about it. It was the laughter of a man who had been the victim of a hoax. He had believed it, but realized that he had been tricked. No one pestered the philosopher with questions. He himself, overcoming the anguish of death, tried to explain. "Now I know what the matter is. I know what the matter is. It's all so simple. Idiocy." Maybe we would have found out what he was thinking, but then the blood rushed down the philosopher's throat, and he died. We dug graves for new victims and then stretched out right on the ashes left from the burned buildings. As night fell, we were awakened by the rumbling of the guns. We were terribly hungry and thirsty. In spite of sleep, it was impossible to regain our strength. Everyone looked terrible. We looked at each other with suspicion, if anyone had a couple of cookies stashed away somewhere, but clearly no one had any food. Even if someone had thought of hiding a ration, we could hardly condemn him. In the darkness, fleeing from the curtain of fire that had been following us since the retreat from the Don, we again heard the noise of tank engines, and again we were seized with panic. The rain, which had started in the morning, did not stop. We followed the lieutenants. God knows where he was dragging us. Everyone was silent, or strength was only enough to barely drag our tired legs, weighed down by the mud. At last the lieutenant said a few words. "Maybe they will pass without noticing us. Does anyone know how to handle anti-tank guns?" We turned in the direction of the enemy trophy Soroka Piatka, intending to give at least some response to the enemy. Fortunately, from fatigue, I did not realize the seriousness of my position. The fact that we stopped brought at least a minute's rest. I was aware that fear would return again, and I realized everything that was happening. The first black silhouette that appeared in sight with its headlights on was apparently a light tank. Soon we heard the sound of its tracks. It was impossible to recognize it. This sound is terrifying. Everyone who has been to the front knows about it. The louder the sound became, the more we panicked. Some of us looked where the tanks were coming from, others, and I was among them, lay down, face down on the ground. In 30 meters 2 black objects appeared. Shots of tank guns rang out. Someone saw the tank and shout, "Hey, hey, there's a cross on it. Friends, it's ours." I still did not understand German well, and this shout sounded to me as a signal to flee. I jumped up and rushed to escape. There were shouts and curses everywhere. The squad took my actions as a signal for everyone to flee. Everyone jumped up, shouting curses at the tankers. Only the lieutenant and 1 or 2 soldiers, who realized what was going on, stayed where they were. Later it occurred to me that we could have been riddled with German tanks if they had mistaken us for Russians. However, the lieutenant managed to explain who we were. We were taken in by a detachment of the 25th Panzer Division, commanded by General Guderian. Guderian's soldiers were perfectly equipped. They had no part in our retreat. They put us on the back of the tanks, on a red-hot engine. No one asked if we had eaten. Only a few hours later, under the fire of Russian artillery shelling Kharkov, did we get hot, thick soup that seemed like the food of the gods. It was here that I first saw a huge Tiger tank and 2 or 3 Panthers. A few hours later, a hail of shells fired by the famous Katyushas bombarded the German infantry, advancing with terrible losses through Slavyansk-Niskov, an area adjacent to the city. Guderian's tanks took us directly to Kharkov, where battles had already been fought on the Donets for weeks. The Wehrmacht again took the city, but in September, after the failure of the counter-offensive at Belgorod, lost it completely. Dawn found us in the sandpits northwest of the city. The officers could think of nothing better than to form us into new formations that did not have a strictly defined profile. They merely corresponded to the total strength of the army, as indicated in the military registers and on maps at headquarters. Companies with different numbers of soldiers did not make any logically organized regiment. The units to which they originally belonged had already assigned them to the number of dead or missing. For the army, these were unexpected reinforcements that there was no reason to spare. As we waited for the orders that were to engage us in the unfolding battles, soldiers sat, lay down, some sleeping, some still awake. I still remember looking out over the valley of the Donets River, the same one with wide sandy banks that reached 8 to 10 miles. From the front, which had moved 20 miles to the south, we could hear the rumble of guns. The Germans were attacking from the north and west. Armoured detachments, whose left wing was covered by troops on the Donets, were crashing into the ranks of the Russian artillery, which had rushed across the river in an attempt to develop a counterattack. Now the batteries were again taken to the river. It was impossible to cross it. The bridges were blown up. In essence, the Russians here made the same mistake as the Germans at Stalingrad, although not on such a scale. Seeking to dislodge our troops, they stretched their rear lines too far and underestimated the troops against them. Within a week at Slavyansk-Niskov were surrounded by 100,000 Russian soldiers, of whom 50,000 were killed. Only many months later I learned what was happening in the vicinity of Kharkov. For me, the battle on the Donets, as well as the battles on the Don and in Ukraine, were only clouds of smoke, endless fear, anxiety, and thousands of explosions. I had just been transferred to another unit and was awaiting further instructions with half a dozen other dirt-covered soldiers when a gendarme handed me a piece of paper. Gendarmes, like commanders, were responsible for getting stragglers and errant soldiers to their destination. On the piece of paper was a diagram showing how to get to the company. We wasted no time in packing. The fear of being included in a newly formed battalion put wings on our legs. I had never possessed a strong sense of direction, but in such chaos even migratory birds would not have determined where north was. The chart indicated only the main points by which to orient ourselves. These names meant something to the regiments stationed on the ground, but to us, who were in a completely unfamiliar terrain, it seemed almost impossible to distinguish one point from another. The few signposts left in the defeated streets had, in the course of the fighting, pointed in the wrong direction. Therefore they could not be trusted. 2 days later, we finally found our company. Temporarily, we were instructed to run the telephone cable for an SS regiment that was on the attack. I still remember the railroad embankment, where the young SS men were advancing under heavy machine gun fire. We took cover in a drainage pipe and waited for the SS to occupy the area, which they did, suffering heavy casualties. Behind 2 cement walls, gunfire was heard. Red-hot shards of metal flew through the air. Then, on the instructions of the regimental commanders, we set up a battery of howitzers, which for several days waged an artillery duel with Soviet guns located on the eastern bank of the Donets. We were hauling heavy shells from a distant warehouse when we came across men from our company fixing a collapsed bunker. The first man I saw was Olensheim. "Hey," I shouted, running to my friend. "It's us." Olensheim stopped like a stumbling block and looked at me as if struck by lightning. "4 more have returned," he shouted. "Then God is with us. Leia's crossed you off the list a long time ago. There are 30 more missing. We thought you'd been riddled with bullets." "Don't crow," I said. "Where's Gals?" "He's the lucky one. He's in Trevd getting treatment while we're out here digging in the dirt." "Is he hurt?" "Oh, he's got a scratch on his cheek. It's nothing. But they took him in with the badly wounded. He said he was unconscious for 2 hours. Always exaggerating." "And Lensen?" "He's fine. He's over there changing a tire." Lowe's showed up. We saluted without hesitation. Good to see you guys. It really is. He shook each of us by the arm. The old soldier's face reflected the feelings that overwhelmed him. Then he retreated a few steps. Announce your arrival loud and clear as I taught you. We uttered the words prescribed by the regulations, feeling a friendly disposition. But apart from this meeting, there was nothing pleasant. The sky was covered with low clouds, threatening to burst into rain, and flashes were seen preceded for a fraction of a second by whole geysers of clods of earth. Soon Lenson, who was heavier and stronger than me, lifted me off the ground, overjoyed that we were together again. Despite the hard labour assigned to us, the day seemed beautiful. 2 days later I reached Trevda, which was 25 miles from the front line. Some soldier gave me a seat in the truck I was to drive, and I was able to see Gales. I found him among the wounded humming something to himself. At last spring came. The badly wounded were walking impatiently along the paths lined with pear trees. Gales could not contain the joy of our meeting. I was led in shouting by soldiers drenched in the medicinal odour. I had to finish off whatever was left at the bottom of the bottles they opened, so I couldn't get there in time to meet the soldier who brought me in. He waited for a while, then he got tired of it, and the driver left without me. I was brought back much later by another driver assigned to my camp. I promised Gales that I would visit him again, but I never got the chance. After a few days the doctor discharged him and he returned to our ranks. Gales did not like the assignments we were given. He persuaded me to enlist in the motorized infantry. We were sick of digging in the ground and serving the fighters. Several times that decision could have cost us our lives, but even now, looking back, I don't regret enlisting in an active unit. Friendships were made that I never met later in life. On a beautiful spring morning we were assembled at Trevd, where Gales once lay in the infirmary. On a hill covered with short grass, the kind in which every blade of grass struggles for a place, and which in a month will become a high savanna, 2 other regiments joined us. The total number here was about 900 men. From the top of the hill the officers, standing on a turned truck, were making speeches. The truck was surrounded by 20 flags and regimental banners. Only good things were said about us. We were even congratulated for our past exploits, which made us blush every time we heard the front reports. We looked at the officers with wide-open eyes. They declared that, given the courage we had shown, they were willing to honour any of us by transferring us to the active troops. Immediately 20 men signed up to volunteer. The officers, recognizing that we were acting too timidly, tried to break our resistance and kept talking about the same thing. After a detailed account of the heroic deeds of German soldiers, 15 more men came out of the ranks, and among them Lenzen, who was always looking for trouble. Then the officers mentioned a 2-week vacation. At once 300 more volunteers came forward. After this, several lieutenants stepped down from the days and passed through our ranks. They selected individual soldiers and invited them to come forward, while the captain, in the meantime, never tired of describing the advantages of offensive detachments. The prospective fighters were selected among the largest, healthiest, and strongest. Suddenly, the index finger in a black leather glove pointed like the muzzle of a Mauser at my best friend, who had become my brother in the war. Gales, as if hypnotized, took 3 broad steps forward. The clatter of his boots sounded to me like the slamming of a door that would separate me, and perhaps forever, with the one friend whose companionship alone could make me fight for life. After hesitating for a moment, I, without any pressure, joined the group of volunteers. Gales' face lit up, like the face of a child who has received an unexpected gift and doesn't even know what to say. From then on, my papers read Etusea, 17th Battalion, Light Infantry, Great Germany Division South. In the evening, we returned to our location. Absolutely nothing had changed. The fact that we had been enlisted as volunteers in the infantry was the only difference in the life we had led yesterday as truck drivers and the life of active duty soldiers. We didn't know how to act, but the sergeants didn't give us time to think. They made us clean and tidy up the armaments that had been damaged in the last battles. It took several days. The hostilities seemed to have subsided, although powerful Soviet counterattacks caused fires to burn in the northwest, near Slavyansk. We were also drawn to the burial of thousands of soldiers who had died in the battle for Kharkov. One morning, at dawn, we were officially called a funeral squad. It was dark as night. Lowe's informed us that, instead of the promised 2-week vacation we were looking forward to, we would be burying soldiers. Typically, captured Russians were used for this, but it was rumoured that they were looting, stealing wedding rings and other jewellery. In fact, I think the poor guys were scavenging corpses for food. The rations they received were the height of absurdity. A third of a pot of weak soup for 4 pounds a day. Sometimes they were given nothing but water. Every prisoner who was caught stealing was shot on the spot. There were no special squads for this purpose. The officer either killed him or handed him over to soldiers who were fond of this kind of occupation. Once I saw with horror how one scoundrel tied prisoners to the bars of a gate. Having secured their arms well, he stuck a grenade in the overcoat of one of them, removed the pin, and ran for cover. The Russians were gutted. Until the last minute they were screaming for help. Although in the war we met a variety of people, what these criminals were doing could not help but outrage us. We got into arguments with them. They got annoyed and insulted us. They said that they had managed to escape from the camp in Tumvos, where the Russians were holding German prisoners of war. Those who agreed to work were given rations as tiny as ours. Those who did not want to work received nothing. 1 cup of millet for 4 people. There was not enough food even for those who did not refuse to work. Some of the new arrivals were simply killed. A favourite method of execution was to drive an empty cartridge into the back of the head. The Russians often amused themselves in this way. I myself believe that the Russians are capable of such cruelty. I have seen how they treat columns of refugees in East Prussia, but the crimes of the Russians do not justify the acts we have committed. All the most disgusting consequences of the war are due to what is done by fools who, from generation to generation, commit torture under the pretext of revenge. For several hours we dug a long tunnel, which in the course of the fighting had become a field hospital. The only illumination came from electric flashlights. They threw beams of light on the gruesome corpses, which had to be pulled out with hooks. Finally, one fine spring morning, which seemed strange in this bleak, ravaged area, a dusty truck drove toward the new barracks we had moved into the day before. Making a turn, it stopped in front of the first building, where several men, including me, were busy cleaning. The back door of the truck opened. A chubby corporal jumped out of it with a click of his heels. Without saluting or saying anything, he slipped his hand into his right breast pocket, where military records were kept. Pulling out a neatly quadruple folded sheet of paper, he read a long list of names. As he read, with a wave of his hand, he made it clear that those whose names were called should take a step to the right. There were about 100 names on the list, among them Olensheim, Lenson, Gales, and Sayer. It was with some fear that I joined those who stood to the right. The corporal said we had 3 minutes to get into the truck with our weapons and backpacks. He clicked his heels again, this time saluting, and without a word he turned his back to us and walked away as if he had gone for a walk. We began to put our belongings away in a hurry. There was no time to talk. 3 minutes later, about 100 panting soldiers were piling into the truck, and the sides of the truck almost fell off. The corporal returned just in time. He looked at the strangely packed backpacks with astonished eyes, but said nothing. Then he bent down and looked at something under the truck. The truck won't hold more than 45 people, he barked. Departure in 30 seconds. It took another 100 steps. We sniffled in silence. No one wanted to go out. Everyone had the best reason to stay inside. 2 or 3 soldiers were shoved in the back. Since I was in the middle, like a sardine in a can, getting out was out of the question. Finally, Los took over. He made half of those in the back of the truck get out. There were exactly 45 men left. The corporal, who'd already climbed into the front seat, ordered the driver to start the engine. Los waved us goodbye and gave us his last instructions. His last smile made us forget all the orders he had given us. Behind him, those who had to get off the truck watched with frozen faces as we disappeared in a cloud of dust. The other half of the listed soldiers joined us 4 days later, 100 miles from the front line, in the camp of the famous Greater Germany Division. Most of the division, mostly wounded, occupied Camp Agturka. The division itself was concentrated in the huge Kursk-Belgorod area. The camp was strikingly clean and orderly. It resembled the Boy Scout camps, however. It was even more luxuriously supplied. Agturka became for us an oasis in the desert of roadlessness. On the order of the corporal, we got out of the truck and lined up in 2 rows. We were approached by a captain, a lieutenant, and a field officer. The chubby little corporal saluted. All 3 officers were rather oddly dressed. The captain resembled a masquerade figure, a tunic of grey-green cloth with red offensive stripes, dark green horseman's pants, and shiny cavalry boots. He waved to us and said something to the field fleet, who was in no way inferior in elegance. After conferring with the captain, the field febel approached us, clicked his heels, and addressed us in a tone that was at least less insulting than that of the corporal who had come to fetch us. "Welcome to the Greater Germany Division," he said. "With us you will lead the life of a real soldier. Only such a life truly unites people. We all consider each other comrades. Each of us at any moment may be put to the test. To be white crows. Those who do not like the camaraderie will not stay long in the division. Everyone must count on the other no matter how they feel about him. One man's mistake affects the whole squad. We don't want those who got here by accident or slobs. Everyone must be ready to obey an order or give an order without hesitation. Your officers will do the thinking for you. Your job is to show them you're worthy of them. You will receive new uniforms and shed your rags. The rule of thumb for a fighting division is cleanliness. We do not tolerate a slovenly appearance." He took a deep breath and continued. "When the preparations are finished, the volunteer squad will receive papers for the 2 weeks' leave they have been promised. Unless otherwise instructed, the vacations will take effect in 5 days when the convoy leaves for Nedrigalov. You may proceed. Hail Hitler!" It was a beautiful day. From what we'd just heard, orders were not to be trifled with here, but it was a change for the better. Before we'd been faced with filth, terror, panic and misery, and we were given leave of absence. Gals was jumping up and down like a mountain goat. The chubby corporal had another nice surprise in store for us, but we were in such high spirits that nothing could dampen our joy. He ordered us to wash our dirty clothes before taking them to the storehouse where we would be issued new uniforms. We turned into laundresses, standing naked in front of long troughs. The underclothes were so soaked with dirt that it was impossible to wash them. I tossed my shorts into the air and ripped my sweatshirt. The same fate befell my socks. I had worn them since the beginning of the retreat, and they had turned into holes. Then, completely naked, we walked across the grass to the warehouse to turn in the old clothes, which were still dripping, and get new ones. 2 women almost choked with laughter when they saw us approaching. "Oh, leave the boots," shouted the field felon, who was not too surprised at our appearance. "There are no boots here." We were given everything new, from caps to first aid kits, but we lacked the essentials like underpants and socks. But then we were filled with joy, and we turned a blind eye to everything. After changing clothes, we went to the wooden barracks building. On the door was a large lettered inscription that reminded us of the need for cleanliness. Laus means death. The chubby little corporal who had brought us from Kharkov led us inside. We curiously looked around the room, which was very unpretentious, but strikingly clean. Since there is no field officer here, I will put one of you in charge." He walked through our ranks with half-closed eyes, as if he wanted the appointment to come as a surprise to whoever he chose. Moreover, it gave the decision more weight. At last he chose a soldier in whom at first glance there was nothing unusual. "You," he shouted. The soldier stepped forward. "What is your name?" "Wiederbeck." "Oh, Weidebeck. Until further orders, you are responsible for the condition of this room. Go to the mess tent and get the division insignia. Everyone must sew them on their sleeves." He enumerated a whole series of other duties, after each of which poor Weidebeck's head bowed lower and lower. Each of us received the famous Greater Germany Division badge, the name of the division written in silver Gothic letters on a black background. The patch stayed on my sleeve until 1945, when a rumor spread that the Americans would shoot anyone wearing a division name rather than a number. At that moment, when there was no time to think, they could just as easily shoot anyone from Greater Germany or Brandenburg as a hero of Leibstandard or Deadhead Division. But those times were still far ahead of us. It was spring of 1943. We were in the conquered territory. The weather was fine, and in our pockets we had permits for a 2-week vacation. After all we had been through, the new life seemed just heavenly. Except for morning and evening roll calls, we were free to go anywhere and have fun. Aktyrka was an amazing place. Between the houses or groups of houses, built in the Russian peasant style, grass grew up to a metre high and wild steppe flowers were visible. The meadows, which sported huge daisies and other strong-smelling flowers that Russians used to make tea, turned brown by the end of summer. In the fields, huge sunflowers caught the eye. Russians, especially Ukrainians, are very cheerful and hospitable people. They are ready to celebrate on any occasion. I remember several feasts in their homes where everyone forgot the sorrows of the war. I have known girls who were laughing, even though they had every reason to hate us. They were quite different from the Parisian beauties, who were only concerned with their appearance and cosmetics. Near each group of houses was its own cemetery, which was never a sad place. On the contrary, there were many flowers and wooden tables where peasants often sat and drank. Each group of houses had a sign with a modified name of the village. Beautiful Aktürke, our town, Aktürke, sweet Aktürke. 4 days after our arrival, the second part of the volunteers arrived. They had to sweat to get to us. They travelled almost the whole way on foot. Finally, on the 5th day, we took our places in the convoy going to Nedrigайлov. Our vacation passes were invalid. They were valid only in Poznan. And from there I had to travel many kilometres to the place where my parents lived, Wizambur. Thus, I'd almost a week's journey ahead of me. We passed through a huge area with a completely flat surface. Not a single hill or ravine. Here and there tractors were working in the fields. We reached Nedrigайлov at a decent speed, on a road rebuilt by army sappers. Every 5 kilometres we could see the remains of Soviet military vehicles left behind in a hurry. We had already travelled about 200 kilometres when our attention was drawn to tiny dots that appeared in the distance against the clear sky. Their outlines were shrouded in clouds. We heard the sounds of explosions. The 2 trucks ahead slowed down and then stopped. As usual, the field officer in charge of the convoy got out of the first truck and took out binoculars, and we waited for the order to get out of the vehicles. Everyone behaved quietly, watched the field officer closely, trying to infer from his behaviour what was going on. In the silence, we could hear the rumbling of the idling engine. The cheerfulness that had appeared on our faces a few days ago was gradually replaced by an expression of fear. Voices were heard, and I thought we were far away from any trouble now. Damn it. Who do you think it is? Partisans, Gals muttered. There were other opinions. Oh, whoever they are, I'm not going to let those bastards ruin my vacation. I wonder what we're waiting for. Tell them to tell us to go out and shoot them. We had already taken the rifles that soldiers were required to carry even on vacation in occupied countries. The very thought that anyone or anything could prevent us from going home made us furious. We were prepared to shoot the first person we met, if that was what it took to drive further west. But the order never came. The field fable climbed into the truck, and the convoy set off again, when after 500 metres we equalled 20 German officers who were carrying guns. We were so relieved that our fears were premature that we began to greet them with shouts, as if the Führer himself was walking in front of us. At last we reached Nedrigайлov, where we left the convoy, which had turned south to go to Romny, where we were to be picked up by a new convoy going west. In Nedrigайлov our ranks were replenished by other soldiers who had also received leave and had come here from all over Russia. There were almost 1,000 of us gathered. However, the trucks were used for many other purposes, but not for the transportation of the soldiers who had received leave. A few trucks headed for Romny took 20 lucky soldiers with them, and we, the ones who stayed here, hung around the field kitchen, designed for only a quarter of our night. In spite of hunger, we decided to walk the 200 kilometres that separated us from Romny, and set out, in spite of the late hour, in the most excellent mood. With us went 20 soldiers who were much older than we were, and who also belonged to the Great Germany Division. There were also 7 or 8 SS men singing to themselves. The others were sipping from bottles that were passed from hand to hand. They must have emptied several cellars. Everyone had a real collection. We walked in threes, as if on a battlefield, marching as fast as we could, trying to shorten the distance between us and Romny. Evening was descending. Our uniforms now seemed to take on the colour of the landscape, like the skin of a chameleon. There was a tart, well-defined odour emanating from the ground. The horizon was disappearing into the boundless void of the darkening sky. The earth became darker, and our form also became darker, as if by magic. Our footsteps set the rhythm of the whole mysterious universe. The darkness of night was descending. We fell silent, amazed by the vastness of our surroundings. We soldiers of an army hated the world over were seized by some inexplicable feeling. Like people who start joking to cover up sadness, we began to sing to keep from thinking. As a hymn to the earth, the S's favourite song rang out, "We are marching further and further on the brown earth, and it will belong to us." Finally, the darkness completely covered us. For the first time in all these months, we were not afraid of it. Although we were all tired, no one suggested we take a break. It was going to be a long drive home, and we didn't want to waste any time. Although our vacation didn't officially begin until we arrived in Poznan, the thought of being home took over. The long journey didn't scare me, even though I rubbed my bare feet with my boots. Who was suffering like me was cursing with his last words the storekeeper of Akhtarka for not giving us socks. After walking about 30 kilometers, we slowed down. The veterans who were walking with us, whose legs were probably made of iron, treated us like whiny children. But they gave us their socks, and we could continue on our way, but managed to walk another 5 kilometers, no more. Since the others kept going, paying no attention to our request to stop, we decided to take off our shoes and walk barefoot on the grass. At first it seemed even better, but soon it didn't help either. Some of us even thought of wrapping our feet in the new coats we had been given, but, frightened by the inspection, they hesitated. The last few kilometers, passed at dawn, became a real tour. The first gendarme post made it even worse. The gendarmes made us wear boots. They would not allow us to enter the city in such a state. We almost killed them. Salvation was found only in the carts of gypsies, who put up those who were quite unfortunate. The hospital was in the same building as the commandant's office. We even managed to talk to the commandant. He was furious. How soldiers from Greater Germany don't even have socks. He sent an angry letter to the Akhtarka camp, in which he trashed the inept officials who could not properly provide for the recruits. Those who needed medical attention went to the hospital. Here their feet were immersed in water with chloroform, which relieved the pain as if by magic. Each of us received a red-coloured metal box with cream to rub on our feet, but we were not given socks. Those who did not go to the hospital began to speculate where we would be sent now the Kharkov-Kiev railroad passed through Romny. Trains left daily in both directions. Therefore, we were terribly upset when our 2 field officers announced that we would stay in the town for 2 days or even more. The trains going to the front were filled with ammunition, and in those that were returning to the rear, all the seats were occupied by seriously wounded. There was not enough room for those who were going on vacation in our 1,500-strong detachment. The most incredible rumours spread rapidly, for every hour was precious to us. We thought how we could get to Kiev on our own. Maybe we could ask the soldiers from the convoy to give us a ride or sneak into the train while it was standing, or even just steal horses from the Russians and ride them. Some agreed to the point of offering to walk 200 kilometers. But even if they galloped, it would take at least 4 days. Anyway, there was nothing left to do but wait. The grumbers wouldn't stop. We'll just sit here until our vacations are over. We have to get out of here. Now they say we'll leave in 2 days, but a week will pass and we'll still be hanging around here. No, we've had enough. We're getting out of here. My legs were so sore that the thought of hiking made my heart ache. Gales and Linson weren't much better, so we had to stay in Romany. We didn't know what to do or even where to sleep. The gendarmes wouldn't let us rest. It was useless to try to explain anything to them. They did not even listen. In the Ukraine, a paradise for soldiers on leave, the gendarmes finally gained the power they had enjoyed in peacetime. It was better not to argue with them, or they would tear up your vacation certificate right in front of your eyes. We saw this happen to a 40-year-old soldier with our own eyes. The gendarmes kicked his satchel like a ball, and he said in annoyance that he had been fighting in the Caucasus for 6 months and would not allow himself to be treated like that. "Murtaurs!" yelled the gendarme. "Traitors, it was you who ran away from the Russians. You left Rostov. All of you must be returned to the front and not sent on leave at all." And the gendarme, right in front of the poor man's eyes, tore his certificate to pieces. He thought he'd cry out in grief. He jumped on both gendarmes and knocked them down. Before we could recover from our astonishment, he was gone. The gendarmes were on their feet, shouting that they would shoot him. We decided to get away before they shot us. They put us on a train full of cattle, but we did not worry about comfort. After all, we only had to get to Kiev, and it was still a few months away from being destroyed, was still beautiful. We were saved. The war was over. Flowers were blooming everywhere. People were living their usual peaceful lives. White buses with red stripes drove past crowds of brightly dressed residents. Soldiers in cleaned uniforms strolled everywhere, walking arm in arm with Ukrainian girls. I had liked Kiev back in the winter, and now the city was even more beautiful. I wouldn't mind if the war ended right here. In Kiev, we easily boarded a train bound for Poland. The journey was in a civilian car, filled to capacity. There were Russians travelling with us. Here we had the opportunity to get to know them better than in the war. The train with different cars ran on a track that led through the endless swamps of Pripyat. The Russians were singing songs, drinking incessantly and offering drinks to the soldiers. There was an incredible noise. People were going in and out of the semi-stations. Jokes of the most obscene nature were drowned in peals of laughter. The women laughed even more than the men. This is how we travelled from Ukraine to Poland. After 2.5 days we arrived in Lublin, where we had to make a change. In Lublin, the gendarmes performed a search, and before departure we were ordered to visit a military barber. But we were so afraid that we would not be able to catch the train that we dared to violate the order. Gales, Lenson, and I managed to pass through the military gendarmerie post unshaven. As it turned out, we had not taken the risk in vain. Otherwise we would have been late. We arrived in Poznan in the middle of the night. Here the reception was properly organised. We were given coupons to the canteen and barracks. We were ordered to report to the headquarters in the morning to register our passports. It was open from 7 to 11 o'clock, but we were advised to come no later than 6 o'clock because there was always a queue. It seemed strange to us to hear such a thing. After all, vacationers who arrived in Poznan, say, at 5 minutes past 12, would have to wait until morning to continue their journey. I think these tricks were designed to maintain troop control over the soldiers even when they were sent on leave. For example, from the Eastern Front, an order could be sent from the Eastern Front to cancel a leave while the man was still on leave. By contrast, the bureau through which soldiers returning to the front passed was open 24 hours a day. We spent the rest of the night in the barracks, which reminded me of Chemnitz, and at 6 o'clock in the morning we were already waiting our turn at the headquarters. There were 20 men in front. They must have spent the whole night there. By 7 o'clock the crowd had reached 300 people. The bureaucrats, who were bursting with importance, took their time checking our papers while we stood in tense silence. The gendarmes at the door were on the alert. In case of anything, whoever lost his temper risked losing his vacation. After getting the necessary stamps on our documents, we went to the hall in the building opposite, where we checked our uniforms. Even earlier, we had been ordered to shine our boots and polish our tunics. Looking at us now, everyone would think that Russia was sterilely clean. When you in a pleasant surprise. Women in uniform handed out delicacies wrapped in paper with images of eagles and swastikas. On the wrapper there was an inscription. Brave soldiers, happy holidays, sweet motherland. She never forgot us. Gals, ready to do anything for meat broth, could not come to his senses. No, if only we had been fed like this in Kharkov. The presents moved us. It seemed that by giving us sausage, jam, and cigarettes, we were repaid for the nights spent in the terrible cold and the journey along the muddy roads near the Don. Gals and I headed for Berlin while Lenson went to Prussia. In Berlin we became convinced that the war was not over at all. Both near the Silesian station and in the districts of Weissensee and Pankow, we could see the ruins of buildings destroyed by the first bombings. But in general, the life of the vast capital went on as usual. I was in Berlin for the first time. Here I was to fulfill a commitment I had made to myself. I decided that I must meet Ernst Neubach's wife, who lived with his parents in the southern part of the city. Els persuaded me to wait until I was in Berlin on my way back. But I knew perfectly well that I would not want to leave my parents' house a day early, and my parents would not want to let me go until the last minute. Gales realized that, even though he tried to talk me out of it, he didn't want to waste time either, so he left for Dortmund at the first opportunity, making me promise that I would visit him. I had better have followed the sensible advice my friend had given me. The very next day, owing to the fire in Magdeburg, I was compelled to remain in Berlin, a city which was a complete stranger to me and where I had to make inhuman efforts to be understood. With my satchel on my shoulders, and with my weapons seeming considerably heavier than before, I began my search for Neubach's house. Fortunately, I was able to read the address scribbled on a note left by my dead friend. But how to get there? Take the subway or the bus? I decided it was best to walk, to find the Neubach's house for sure. At that time, it was not unusual to cross the city on foot. However, I didn't want to go west when I needed to go south. I saw a sign, South Berlin, which at least gave me the right direction. I passed 2 gendarmes who gave me a long, cold. I saluted them and then continued on my way. The city was beautiful, but it had the atmosphere of a military capital. The bombardment had only recently begun. The districts in the immediate vicinity of the railroad stations had suffered. Everything in this stately city, with its austere houses surrounded by lush, intricate hedges, seemed to follow a precise rhythm. There were no noisy crowds, no parents pulling down their children's pants to urinate. Men, women, children, bicycles, cars, trucks moved in the same rhythm in a clearly defined direction. They seemed to have deliberately chosen a pace at which no energy could be wasted. How rarely was this environment different from what I had seen in Paris? Unnecessary haste was unacceptable in Berlin. My feet moved by themselves in a set rhythm. It was simply impossible to stop without a good reason. That huge mechanism created by the regime was at work. I could even guess it from the gestures of the little old woman walking in front of me. I stopped her to ask for directions to the address I needed. Her neatly arranged grey hair was in perfect harmony with the impeccable beauty of the city. The sound of my voice seemed to rouse her from her sleep. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said with a sense of awkwardness, as if I had spoken in a theatre after the play had begun. "Could you help me? How do I get to this address?" I showed her a piece of paper that looked like it had been pulled out of a dumpster. The old woman smiled as if she'd seen an angel. "It's a long way, young man," she said in a soft voice that reminded me of my childhood. "It's a long way. You have to go to the Temple Highway, but it's very far." "It doesn't matter." I couldn't think of anything else to say. "I think better to take the bus. It would be much easier." "It doesn't matter," I repeated, as if in a dream. I couldn't think of any other German words. The kindness of the old woman, which seemed strange after the shouting of the military, touched me. "It is not difficult for me to go. I am an infantryman," I finally realized what to say and smiled. "I know," the old woman said. She smiled even more gently now than she had a moment before. "You must have walked a lot. I will take you to Emperor Wilhelm's castle, and from there I'll show you the way." The old woman came with me. I didn't know what to say, so she took the initiative. "Where are you from, young man?" "Russia." "Russia is a big country. Where have you been?" "Yes, it's big. I've been in the south near Kharkov." "No, Kharkov," she said with an accent. "That's right. It's a big city." "Yes, it is." For my lovely travelling companion, Kharkov was nothing more than a name to be forgotten. For me, Kharkov is a city bereft of life, a city that used to be big, but now has turned into a pile of ruins. There is dust, smoke, flames, screams and groans that you don't hear in ordinary cities. A long corridor of corpses to be dragged out into the air, and 3 Bolsheviks tied to a hedge with their entrails sticking out of their bellies. "My son is in Bryansk," said the old lady. She evidently hoped that I would give her news from Bryansk. I repeated thoughtfully. "It seems to be in the central district. I've never been there." He writes that everything is fine. He is a lieutenant in an armoured division. "Lieutenant," I thought. "Officer? You must have had a hard time, huh?" "Yes, I've been through a lot. Everything's all right now, though. I'm on vacation," I added with a smile. "I'm happy for you, young man. I really am," she said quite sincerely. "Have you come to Berlin to visit your family?" "No, ma'am. I want to see a friend's parents." "A friend? He's no friend now, Ernst. He's dead." For what friend am I wandering around the city for an hour? The old woman was getting on my nerves. A friend probably from your regiment," she said, as if she were enjoying her vacation with me. I had the urge to stake her on one of the fancy hedges. "Where are your parents from?" she asked. "Weisenberg. That's in Alsace." She looked at me in surprise. "Yes, Alsatian," I said, hoping she would leave me alone. The old lady began to tell me how she had travelled to Strasbourg, but I was no longer listening. She made me think of Ernst, and I could not forgive her for that. It was a beautiful day, I had a vacation, and I needed to see something joyful. I began to think about how to behave when I went to see the new box. After all, they had just lost their son. They might be overwhelmed with grief, or maybe they don't even know he died. If that's the case, how do I break the news to them? It's better to visit them on the way back. Then they'll know for sure. Gals was right. I should have done what he said. At least he's alive. We came to a crossroads where there was a bridge across a little stream, or maybe a big river. I knew for certain that the Seine flowed in Paris, but whether Berlin was on the Elbe or the Oder, I did not know. To the right were several imposing buildings. the castle of Emperor Wilhelm, and directly across the street was a large monument to the heroes of the War of 1914–1918. Several helmets of the time spread out in the courtyard. They symbolized the sacrifices made by the people during the war. 2 sentries from Hitler's personal guard walked slowly across the cement-covered ground in front of the monument. Their slow steps caused me to think of man's movement toward eternity. With a precision that a watchmaker of the highest order would envy, the 2 soldiers half-turned, facing each other at a distance of 30 meters, resumed their stride, came together, turned and started again. These movements made a depressing impression on me. Here we are, young man, said the old lady. You need to cross the bridge and go on down this street. She pointed to a huge mass of stone buildings. Somewhere here was the house I wanted, but I stopped listening. I knew I was not going to the Newbacks. Her explanations were no longer necessary. Nevertheless, I surpassed myself in expressions of gratitude, even shook the old lady's hand. She went away, repeating that there was no need to thank her. I couldn't help smiling. As soon as she was out of sight, I rushed back to where we had come from, trying to catch up on lost time and get as quickly as possible to the station where the train was leaving for the west. I ran down the embankment with the speed of a crazed maniac. Suddenly the sound of marching was heard in the air, and a military band marched down the alley. The musicians were dressed in splendid uniforms. I remembered what we had been taught in Bialystok and saluted the commander, who did not pay the slightest attention to me. Half an hour later, stopping several times to ask directions, I arrived at the station where trains were leaving for Western Germany and France. I tried desperately to find Gals among the soldiers crowded on the platform. He would surely be on the same train. But in the few minutes remaining before departure, I never managed to see him. I noticed that the rhythm of the train, which was picking up speed, matched the rhythm of the city. Everything was strikingly different from Russia. Even in the soldiers, one could feel the solidity with which the civilized and organized life of European countries was filled. All this was unlike anything I had seen in Russia. I thought everything I had experienced there was only a bad. Night came. We had been driving for 3 hours, maybe more, but it seemed that we would never get out of the city. There were no suburbs in sight, just buildings. Suddenly the train stopped, but not at the station. Everyone looked out of the windows to see what had happened. Despite the darkness, bright red flashes lit up the sky in the distance. We could hear the muffled hum and the firing of anti-aircraft guns. From the roar of airplanes shook the windows of the train. They're bombing Magdeburg. That's right, said a soldier who had squeezed in next to me at the window. Who here's bombing? I asked. He looked at me in surprise. Yankees, who else? He thought he was dealing with an asshole. It's tough out here, just like at the front. I couldn't take my eyes off the burning city. I thought the war was a thing of the past. The train started again, but after a quarter of an hour it stopped again. Soldiers ran along the train. They made everyone get off. Someone said that the track had been bombed, and all military men, whether on leave or not, would have to go under the authority of the local authorities. That's how I, in my cleaned uniform with a present, went to clear the rubble with the rest of the soldiers. Probably half an hour we walked. Wading through the acrid smoke of the fires began to dismantle logs and stones. At that time bombs were blowing to pieces the remaining population of the city. The civilians, trembling with fear, were put into teams to rake the ruins. The military, shouting at the top of their lungs, were in charge. Everyone was forced to work. Night was in full swing. It was as bright as day. The flaring gas in the ruptured pipes gave as much light as the flares that cast a deadening glow on the piles of stones, logs, broken glass, furniture, and people's feet and hands. Local volunteer soldiers handed out pickaxes to us. We stacked the rest of our equipment by the fire trucks. We had to remove the rubble as quickly as possible. We could hear the screams and groans of those buried in the basement. Women and children, sobbing with fear, were carrying bricks and stones on carts. Shouts could be heard everywhere. No, hurry, come here. Help is needed here. Hey, the water pipe has burst. It's flooding the basement. Of course, the military had to deal with the most dangerous cases. They were sent to places where the danger of collapse was particularly great. We got into the cellars through deep ventilation shafts. To get into the place where the screams were coming from, it was necessary to break down a brick wall. My pickaxe hit something soft, probably the stomach of some poor guy buried under the rubble. I don't care. I'm on vacation, and instead of rest I have to dig here. The ground shook from the explosion. Another American time bomb had exploded, and yet we had not tried in vain. The last brick wall fell under our blows. Through the resulting gap in the cloud of dust began to get out exhausted, blackened people. Some of them rushed to embrace us, rejoicing that their imprisonment had finally come to an end. All the prisoners were wounded. We had to go down into the cellar ourselves to tear the frantic women away from the children. They were clutching them so tightly that they almost strangled them. I pulled out the first child that caught my eye. A 5-year-old clung so tightly to my pants that they came out of my boots. He was dragging me somewhere. He was sobbing so hard that his breath caught between sobs. The boy led me to an alcove in the wall where a bottle cage held up a vault ready to collapse. At my feet, a human body could be seen beneath the ruins. The child continued to sob. I shouted with all my might. "Light, quick!" Someone brought a fire. We saw the corpse of a woman buried under the ruins of a wine bottle storage room. Beside her lay a dead child clinging to its mother. I managed to pull the child's body away from the mud. It seemed to move, dragging 2 children with me. I headed for the exit, handed the rescuers the child I was holding in my hands. The second one dragged after me for some time, but I pulled him away from me. He is able to take care of himself. In Germany, everyone must be ready to take care of himself, and the sooner the better. Our hands were needed elsewhere. The sirens were blaring again. The British and Americans were coming back, as always. They are ready to organize a second bombing while we rescued the victims of the first. The brigadiers signaled a withdrawal. There were voices. Now take cover. But where to find shelter? Within 100 meters, there's nothing but ruins. Those who at least a little bit oriented on the terrain rushed to run in the most likely direction. Scared children crying to death. Above us came the roar of airplanes. I ran too, but I knew what I was looking for. The fire truck disappeared, but our satchels remained where they were. In a hurry, the soldiers pulled out their packs and ran away. I recognized my satchel by the metal edelweiss I had sewn onto the strap. I grabbed it, grabbed my rifle. What about my presents? Damn it! Hey, you! My package! Somebody threw me the package. Everybody got away. Hey, that's the wrong one. Wait. Oh, shit. Bombs were exploding on the other side of town. No more presents. I ran across the square, dodging a car in as much of a hurry as I was. 400 and 500,000 bombs were exploding, broken glass flying everywhere. There was almost no one left on the streets. Only idiots like me were still looking for shelter. Despite the acrid smoke, I could see the silhouettes of houses in the bright flashes. On one of them I could make out a white sticker that read in black letters, "Bomb Shelter." 30. What did it matter if there were already 100 people sheltering there? I ran down the curved staircase that ran between the 2 surviving walls of the building. Someone had thought to attach a lamp that illuminated the turns of the stairs. But after 2 turns, a large grey cylinder blocked the way. I tried to squeeze past it, but when I looked closer, my blood froze in my veins. It was a huge bomb with a broken plumage. So it went through every floor of the building. It weighed at least 4 tons and could explode at any minute. I galloped down the stairs back into the darkness, which was lit up like a neon sign with uneven flashes. Finally, trying to catch my breath, I threw myself under a bench in the square and lay there for about 20 minutes until the sirens announced the end of the bombing. When it finally subsided, I went back to the soldiers who had cleared away the rubble. It was not until morning that I was released. That's when I learned the news that made me despondent. I was eager to continue my journey west. I'd already wasted 2 days of vacation. Now every minute was precious to me. I asked a local soldier how to find the train to Kassel and Frankfurt. He demanded my pass, examined it, and told me to follow him. The soldier led me to the military gendarmerie station. Through a small window, I watched my pass pass from hand to hand. A few stamps were added to the piece of paper brought from Aktürke. Then the pass was returned to me, and I was informed in a cold tone that I would not be able to travel further than Magdeburg. It turned out that I had reached the extreme western point to which my vacation pass applied. From the shock I could not recover. I stood and looked at the gendarmes in silence. "We understand that you are upset," said one of the gendarmes in the same official tone. "The city reception centre will take care of you." Without a word, I took the leave slip from the desk where the gendarme had put it and walked out the door. A sob froze in my throat. The sun was still shining brightly outside. I walked, staggering like a drunken man. The people around me looked at me. I felt ashamed, looked for a place to gather my thoughts, took refuge in the ruins of a large building, sat down on a rock, grabbed my stamped pass and cried like a child. The sound of footsteps made me raise my head. Someone, mistaking me for a marauder, had followed me. Seeing that I was just out of breath, the person returned to the street. In those days, people were thankfully more concerned about ration cards than tears. I was able to be alone with my grief. In the evening of the same day, I boarded a train bound for Berlin. Fate itself was forcing me to see the Newbucks. I did not know where my German relatives lived, although at that time they lived in the vicinity of Berlin. Either to go to the commandant's office or to the Newbucks. I could not calm down. I was looking forward to this vacation. I had earned it. I had enlisted in the infantry for its sake. And now all I had in my hands was an unnecessary piece of paper. Even the package of presents is gone. I left it in Magdeburg. Now I'll have to go empty to the Newbucks, people I've never seen before. I had no money to buy anything. That night I was lucky. At the Berlin commandant's office I was directed to a barracks where I was given a bed. An old soldier who had heard my story about the pass advised me to talk to the field officer in charge of registration. He listened sympathetically to my story, wrote down all the details, and told me to come back in 24 hours. The next day early in the morning I went in search of the Newbucks' house. After some wandering around the city, I finally found myself in front of number 112 Clearingstrasse, a simple 3-story house with a gravel driveway. It was separated from the street by a gate. A girl about my age was peering out of the half-open door into the street. I hesitated a little, but decided to ask her if I was in the right place. "This way," she said with a smile. "This is the house you want. They live on the 2nd floor, but they're at work at the moment." Thank you, Fraulein. Do you know when they'll be back?" "In the evening, about 7 o'clock. Thank you," I said, wondering how long I'd have to wait. What to do in the meantime? As I closed the gate, I thanked the girl again. She smiled shyly and nodded. Who was she waiting for? Certainly not the Neighborhofs. I'd already walked a little way down the Clearingstrasse when it occurred to me that I could talk to the girl a little longer. After hesitating, I turned around, hoping she hadn't left yet. I was ready to listen to any answer and was soon on my way to the 112 number. It was as if the girl had never left. "No. Do you think they're back already?" She laughed. "No, of course not. But I'm a stranger in this town. I'd rather sit here on the stairs than wander around looking for home again. You'll have to wait all day." The girl didn't hide her surprise. "I suppose so. But you could walk around Berlin. It's very beautiful here." "I agree, that's what I should do. But really, in my condition, I can't see anything. My grief was so great that I didn't even want to flirt with her." "Are you on vacation?" "Yes, I have 12 more days. But I can't leave the Berlin area." "You're back from the Eastern Front?" "Yes." "It must be terrible there. It's written all over your face." I looked at her in surprise. I suspected that I looked like a funeral home employee, but I had never expected a nice girl to tell me that in the first few minutes of a conversation. Then she said something about people living on the 3rd floor, but I stopped listening. If she really thinks I look awful, the conversation that had reconciled me to reality for a little while would soon end. The thought of it terrified me. I was willing to do anything to continue our conversation. I tried to force a smile out of myself and pretend to be a pleasant conversationalist. I awkwardly asked her if she knew the city. "Oh, yes," she replied, unaware of the trap I was setting for her. "I had moved to Berlin before the war started." She studies part of the day and spends the rest of the time in the first aid brigade in 8-hour shifts. She's going to be a teacher. I listened, half listening. The sound of her voice was so pleasant that all I wanted was for her to keep talking. I tried to make her like me. When she stopped talking, I remarked, "Since you don't have to be in the air until 5 anyway, could you show me the sights of the city? That is, of course, if you're not busy." She flushed a little. "I'd love to," she said, "but I need to speak to Frau X." "I see. But I have plenty of time, 12 days. She laughed. A good sign, I thought. So we chatted for almost an hour until Frau X came in. We couldn't avoid talking about the war, of course. although I would have preferred to avoid the subject. But I tried to embellish my story. I made up feats I had never seen. I didn't want to tell her everything as it was. I didn't want her to feel what we had been through. Why should she care about the mud, the blood, the grey horizon that wouldn't get out of my head? I was afraid of infecting her with the fear and pain that overwhelmed me, afraid that she would not want to listen. I told her about heroic deeds, reminiscent of Hollywood movies. We laughed merrily and our conversation never broke down. Finally, Frau X appeared. At first she looked at us with disapproval. But then Paula, that was the girl's name, explained that I was a friend of the Newbachs. No, to tell you the truth, Mum, I was friends with their son Ernst. I wanted to visit his family. I understand, young man. Don't hesitate to come and wait here. You'll be much more comfortable. The Newbachs, what a disaster. How could they bear it? 2 sons lost in 10 days. It's just awful. I pray to God the war is over before my son is killed. So the Newbachs have already been informed. Not only Ernst, but also another son. I didn't even know Ernst had a brother. Ernst, Don the Tetra. Ernst, I'll save you. Don't cry, Ernst. It was only by looking at Paula that I was able to erase the image of the past. It must be erased from my memory. I must forget everything. With Paula by my side, she smiles. Forget how hard it is. If you want to wait here, or let's go to my place, repeated the old lady. She addressed the 17-year-old as a grown man. How did Ernst die? I'm sorry. It's hard for me to talk about it. I lowered my eyes. But that didn't help. My gaze fell on my boots, the very boots I had used to tread the earth on Ernst's grave. Everything reminded me of him except Paula's smile. Then you'll have to think of something, the kind-hearted woman said, realizing what was behind my silence. You may rest assured, madam, I replied. I have experience in this. Frau UX, she turned the conversation to another subject, not wishing to upset me further. She was, as it turned out, a dressmaker, and Paula helped her. We went upstairs. Frau X brought a large jug of cocoa and milk and started a conversation with Paula. I hope, Paula, you won't let our friend Sayer get bored here. Be sure to show him unto Den Linden and the Victory Hall. The young man needs to take his mind off his dark thoughts. I'm letting you go for the day. I was ready to kiss her. But, Frau X-Bente, what about the work I have to? No. You'll show him the city. There's nothing more urgent. I thanked the kind woman from the bottom of my heart. Was Paula happy about the unexpected day off? I didn't care. I was too happy with the way things were and didn't want to think about other people's feelings. We headed for the mountains, promising to be back by lunchtime. I walked beside Paula, unaware of my joy. To tease me, she walked with the same broad military stride that I did. We passed a red-painted booth that sold dried fish. It occurred to me to buy Paula a fish. She followed me, smiling her delightful smile. The woman who sold the fish put 2 portions on thick slices of bread and added butter. After that, she asked us for ration cards. But I don't have a card. I'm here on vacation. I smiled, hoping to mollify the vendor. But it didn't work. Paula was laughing her ass off. I felt like a complete idiot. Choke on your fish. I added in French. Lunch with Paula's hostess exceeded all my expectations. Despite the scarcity, the kind woman prepared excellent meals. She brought out wine. I drank a glass to swallow the lump in my throat and immediately felt that I was getting drunk. I left the table in a strange high spirits and began to hum a march. But neither Paula nor Frau X. Of course, neither Paula nor Frau X. Delayed in coming to my senses, I apologized to them, though I dragged out another song, which, however, was no better. The landlady looked at me with a look of surprise, with fear mixed in. Paula fidgeted in her chair. I seemed to them to be a creature from another world. The landlady, thinking that in such a state I would spoil her porcelain, suggested that Paula take me out for some fresh air. Obediently, Paula dragged me out of the apartment. The company of a drunken soldier who might do something stupid at any moment was not to her liking. Down the stairs, my shyness gave way to an out-of-nowhere insolence. I grabbed Paula by the waist and twirled her around in a dance, shuffling her braided feet. She frowned and pushed me away so sharply that I nearly sprawled on the floor. Stop it, or I'm not going anywhere with you, she said. I felt like I'd been splashed with cold water. What an idiot I was. Because of my own stupidity, I might have lost Paula forever. Paula, I screamed in despair. I froze in place. Paula had already come down the stairs and was standing in the doorway. Her figure was illuminated by the sun. "All right," she said. "Let's go, but you have to behave yourself." I was still in a daze, but I was glad for the sudden happiness. "What else do you want to see?" "I don't know, Paula. Whatever you say." I'm still in a daze. Paula's tired of dealing with a drunken soldier. I should have become an officer. Paula's irritated voice echoed in my ears. In my blurred consciousness, I heard the voice of a field officer. "Hey, you there. Get in the Tatra." "Well, have you decided? Where shall we go?" "Drive." "Watch where you're going. There are stains on your uniform. Be more careful next time." "Well, have you made up your mind?" "Yes, Mr. Lieutenant." "Yes, of course, Paula." Suddenly she grabbed my sleeve, bringing me out of my half-asleep state. I looked at her. There must have been sadness in my eyes. She was surprised. "Let's at least go to the square," she said. "We'll decide there. Let's go." Paula pulled me with her. I did not resist, although I knew that if we ran into an officer or a military gendarme, my vacation would immediately turn into work in a labor camp. Holding a girl's hand in the street was strictly forbidden. But when I mentioned this to Paula, she only laughed. "Don't worry about that. I'm not drunk. I'll spot them in time." Since I had almost lost the ability to speak, Paula took the initiative. She took me all over the city, showing and telling me, but I couldn't think of anything but her. I felt good with her. She fascinated me more and more with her sincerity and attracted me with something mysterious and enigmatic that I could not find a name for, but felt every minute. She wore a dark skirt and a light silk blouse with a tiny lace collar. The heels of fancy shoes tapped on the sidewalk. We walked down a paved street with narrow, tiled sidewalks lined with stone bevels and curbs. The walls of many of the houses were thickly green with grapes. Some of them were covered with its clinging vines up to the third floor. Near the Gothic bulk of the cathedral, the street curved away, and further on a wide expanse of space shone above the linden trees. A stone bridge over the moat was visible in the distance. It was the entrance to an ancient, dilapidated castle, on the other side of which, in the depths of a shady park, stood a palace behind a shapely fence. "It's a museum there now," said Paula. "We shall go there some day. I love antiquity. And now let's go down to the embankment of our beautiful spree." Paula spoke sincerely, but I could not drive away the feeling that she was only doing her duty, and that she did not really feel the slightest pleasure in talking to me. Indeed, I did not know why I was wandering through the neat streets of Berlin. Why should anyone tolerate a drunken soldier on the sole ground that he has spent many months in snow, mud, and terror? Those who are happy cannot understand people who are afraid of joy. I still had to learn to understand others, to adjust and behave calmly, not to shock anyone, to smile properly, not too wide, not too strained. At the risk of sounding rude or indifferent, I have to avoid the impression that I think I gave after the war in France, telling boring stories about the war. I sometimes wanted to kill those who accused me of lying. I, a lousy soldier who had the misfortune to serve in the enemy army, needed to learn how to live, because dying was not working out for me. At 5 o'clock, at the Oderberg Rasige, having given detailed instructions on how to get back to the Clearingstrasse, Paula left me. When she said goodbye, she held my hand and smiled as if she were sorry to part with me. "I'll drop in on the Newbucks in the evening," she said. "Anyway, I'll see you tomorrow." Good night, Paula." In the evening I met the Newbucks. In Mrs. Newbucks's face I easily recognized my friend. The unhappy people didn't want to talk about the tragedy that had put an end to their dreams. The idea of a post-war Europe no longer meant anything to them. Those who were to inherit it had died. Nevertheless, they tried their best to make me feel as welcome as possible. Frau UX, who had so nobly offered to wet my throat in the afternoon, also joined us. After 11 o'clock Paula appeared briefly. Our eyes met. Paula made a joke. Hey, I had to give him a lesson in manners in the afternoon. He started singing and dancing in the middle of the street. I looked at the faces of my new acquaintances. Would they scold me or laugh? Luckily, we all laughed together. "You did a bad thing, Paula," said the kind Frau X. "Ask him to forgive you." Paula, blushing, walked around the table with a smile and kissed me on the forehead. I sat as if condemned to the electric chair, covered in paint and unable to move. Everyone realized this and shout, "Nothing charity." Paula joyfully said goodbye to us and disappeared out the door. Paula. I don't know what I wanted. I sat petrified, not knowing what was going on at the table. They asked me about my parents, about my former life, but, thank God, not about the war. My answers were evasive. Paula's kiss burned on my forehead. I would have loved to stand guard with her alone every day, instead of with 5 or 6 soldiers. It was getting late. I looked for an excuse to leave the table, but I had to sit with my amiable hosts for another hour, when at last everyone had not gone to bed. The Newbacks offered me Ernst's room, and was gratefully. The military order is such that I have to return to the centre. In fact, the thought of sleeping in Ernst's bed made me uncomfortable. Besides, I wanted to walk the streets. Maybe I'd run into Paula. The Newbacks understood the rigours of military regulations and didn't insist too much. On the street I was suddenly overcome with joy and whistled. Cheerfully asked passers-by how to get to the centre and easily reached the barracks. I didn't meet Paula. I passed an office where 2 civilians were playing cards with soldiers. One of them was a field officer who had promised to solve the problem of my vacation. "Hey, you," he called out. I turned around and saluted. "Is that you, Sergeant Sayer?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Field Fleble." "Good. I've good news for you. Some of your family will be here to visit you in a couple days. I was able to get your family a pass." "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Fieldfell. Really, I'm very grateful." I can see that, boy." I clicked my heels, turned around, and 4 men were making jokes about me. "You had fun at the Hotel Fantasio, huh?" They probably meant the brothel. I went to bed, but had a sleepless night, with Paula on my mind. 2 days passed, filled with joy. I never left Paula's side. We dined at Frau UX, and dined at the Newbacks. Frau UX, from whom nothing can be hidden, noticed that there were feelings between me and Paula. It frightened her. She let me know several times that the war was not over yet, and it was foolish to fall in love in such an environment. Later I might reveal my feelings, but right now it was premature to think about love. In my unformed mind, the war could not affect my love for the girl in any way. Nothing else was out of the question. The only limitation was the length of the vacation, but that was not up to me. Since someone from my family had to visit me, I couldn't go too far from the centre, so I slept there. But I was losing valuable time that I could have spent with Paula. On the day of my parents' expected arrival, I returned to the centre 5 or 6 times. Finally, towards evening, a kindly paramedic told me, "Someone is waiting for you at the barracks, Herr." "Ah," I remarked, as if I had least expected it. "Thank you, Herr Fieldflebel." I ran up the steps and opened the door of the large room where I had spent several nights. Quickly glancing around the double row of bunks, I met my eyes with a man in a dark grey overcoat. It was my father. "Hello, Dad," I said. "You've grown up," my father said in his usual shy tone. "How are you? We don't know much about you. Mother is worried sick." I listened carefully, as I always did when I talked to my father. I realized that here, in the heart of Germany, in the barracks, where everything reminds me of unquestioning military discipline, he feels out of place. "Shall we go outside, Dad?" "Yes, suit yourself. Oh, by the way, I brought you a little something. Mom and I spent a long time collecting it. The Germans are holding it downstairs." When he said Germans, he lowered his voice as if he were talking about a gang of bastards. Even though his father had married a German, he had never felt good about Germany. He never got over the horrors of the First War, although he was treated well as a prisoner of war. But the fact that one of his sons was in the German army prevented him from listening to the news on the London radio. Downstairs, I asked the field officer where the parcel was. He handed it to me and addressed my father in perfect French. "I am very sorry, monsieur, but it is forbidden to bring food into the barracks. Here is your—" "Thank you," replied my father. He was obviously embarrassed. As we walked along the streets and talked, I looked at the contents of the parcel. A bar of chocolate, a cookie, and oh joy, a pair of socks that my caring grandmother had knitted. Yes, what I'd been missing. I thought cigarettes and chocolate would be your favourite things. But of course you have no shortage of those. My father was convinced that all we did was feast from morning till night. It's different here. The Germans take everything. Yes, we're fine. I've learned to enjoy today and not think about what tomorrow brings. Well, all the better. We're not doing so great. Your mother can barely scrape together something to eat. It's not easy for us. I didn't know what to say, and I wanted to give him back the gift. Yes, my father said. We can only hope that the war will be over soon. They're giving the Germans a light. All you hear on London radio. Americans this, Americans that. Italy. What my father said was news to me. A detachment of naval marines marched by in song. I saluted as I should. My father looked at me with disgust. Nothing could please him when the hell was going on in France. For 24 hours, he talked to me about the sufferings of France, explaining them in such detail as if he were talking to a Canadian or an Englishman. I found myself in a difficult position, not knowing how to take his words. I restrained myself, limiting myself to short remarks. Yes, Papa. Of course, Dad. I would have liked to talk about something else, to forget the war, to tell him about my love for Paula. But I was afraid he wouldn't understand me and would only get angry. The next day I accompanied my father, who was in a gloomy mood, to the station. Like a fool, I took my visor when the train was leaving, which made him feel even worse. His worried face floated past me. It was a hot June evening. I would not see him again until 2 years later, years that would stretch into eternity. As soon as my father left, I rushed to the Newbucks' house. I apologized for not introducing my father. After all, we had spent so little time with him. They understood and were not offended. Understanding my impatience, Mrs. Newbuck said that Paula would be gone until tomorrow. How could I bear it? We had already lost a whole 24 hours, plus day and night. I had only 7 or 8 days left, so every hour was precious. During the Newbucks' dinner, I kept a gloomy silence, but they respected my feelings. Then I went wandering through the streets, hoping to meet my beloved. In this way I walked for nearly an hour. The clock struck 11, and then it was drowned out by the roar of sirens. It could be heard everywhere. The few lights on the streets were gone. The firemen and gendarmes had already come to the defense of the city. Over the black sky of Tempelhof, engines roared, their exhaust streaking through the air. The streets were filled with motorcycles of local vigilance. They urged the few passers-by to take cover. I stayed on the street. Immediately I was hit by a barrage of enemy bombs. I knew that as soon as the bombing started, the first aid teams would start working. That meant I might meet Paula. I stood in the doorway opposite the entrance to the bomb shelter in a low house near the canal. From here I had a view of the canal and the distant horizon, slightly covered by a small mist. In the northwest the sky was lit up by flashes of fire that seemed faint. They must have been firing on the factories in Spandau. Here and there flashes appeared, just like fireworks. Countless air defense guns created an impenetrable barrier against the deadly cloud coming at us. Each bright flash that suddenly appeared in the sky and fell to the ground meant the death of another enemy plane. The wall I was leaning against was shaken by the explosion. Though my eyes ached from the continuous alternation of bright lightning and darkness, I kept my eyes fixed on the street and the embankment where people were running, still without shelter. The cacophony of shattered glass then announced that bombs had hit the city a kilometre away from me. Big waves came down the canal. Everything around me was falling apart. Even though I wanted to stay on the street, the feeling of fear overpowered me. I ran to the shelter. The sidewalk beneath my boots resounded. Soon I was making my way through a crowd of frightened people. The atmosphere was suffocating. A powerful roar came from above and below at the same time, knocking bits of plaster off the ceiling. People looked for support from each other and found none. Children, with their usual naivety, asked, "What's that howling?" Mothers responded by stroking their blonde heads with trembling fingers. Those lucky enough to believe in God prayed. I leaned against the pipe that carried every sound. Every tremor that came from the street, the noise of the engines grew louder and louder. The air froze in my lungs. Then there was a rumble, as if 1,000 locomotives were coming at us. From the darkness came the screams of people who could not remember themselves from terror. The electricity came on. Then the whole bomb shelter was filled with thick, dark dust from outside. Someone shout, close the door. The door slammed shut. We found ourselves in a mass grave. Some women were howling and tearing their hair. 5 or 6 times, as if driven by a super-powerful force, the floor shook. We clung to each other. An hour later, when the storm subsided, we all ran out of the hellhole. We saw a sight worthy of Dante's pen. The dark waters of the canal were illuminated by the flames of a fire that had engulfed the parapet. What had once been a neat little street had become a pile of rubble, bordered by two gigantic crevices. The summer sky reflected the flames of the fires, with acrid, choking smoke billowing from everywhere. People were running in different directions. As in Magdeburg, I was immediately included in the team that was busy removing the debris. After such a night and most of the morning, I was exhausted. At last I managed to find Paula, who felt no better than I did. The joy that came over me when she told me she was worried about me repaid me for the night. "And I've been thinking about you, Paula. I was looking for you all night." "Did you?" I could tell from her tone that she felt the same way I did. I couldn't take my eyes off the young girl. I wanted to hold her in my arms. I felt myself blushing. She broke the silence. I can hardly stand on my feet," Paula said. "Why don't we go out of town to Tempelhof? It would be better." "That's a good idea, Paula. Let's go." I persuaded a passing motorcyclist, and Paula and I drove to the civil and military airfield in Tempelhof. Once off the highway, we climbed a hill covered with some spongy lichen and enjoyed stretching out on it. It was a beautiful day. A kilometre away from us, the terrain was crisscrossed by airport tracks, from which Focke-Wulf training planes were taking to the sky at an amazing speed. Paula was lying on her back, her eyes closed, sound asleep. I leaned on my elbow and looked at her as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. 1,000 words about love were running through my head, but I couldn't make a sound. I realized that now I could and must tell her everything, that I couldn't wait any longer, that the moment couldn't be better, that it was silly to be so shy. Maybe Paula was keeping silent on purpose to let me speak. Time is running out, my vacation is ending. But no matter how much I persuaded myself, my love for Paula could not find the right words. She whispers, "Hey, how bright the sun shines." I replied with some silly phrase. Finally, daring to dare, I reached out my hand to her. Our fingertips touched. For a while I stood still and just felt this amazing touch. Finally, gathering all my courage, I took her palm in mine. She did not resist. Shyness had become a bigger obstacle than a minefield for me. I lay on my back for a while longer, gathering my strength, looking up at the sky and not remembering myself from happiness. Everything around me ceased to exist. Paula turned to face me. Her eyes were closed as before, and her hand was clutching my arm. I think I said that I loved her, and then I took a long time to collect my thoughts. I don't know whether I said anything or not. Paula didn't move. I thought I was dreaming. There was a roar of sirens in the air, announcing the neighborhood. We looked at each other. "Is that an air raid?" Paula asked. The possibility seemed unlikely. At that time, daytime raids were still rare, but it was impossible to be wrong. Yes, airplanes were coming into the city. At the airport, airplanes were gaining speed on the walkways. Fighter planes are coming, Paula. It's really an air raid." "You're right. Looks like people are running for shelter. And we need to go to the shelter, Paula. But we're perfectly safe here. It's not a city. They'll bomb Berlin again?" "I guess you're right. We're not as safe here as we are in these suffocating holes." Above our heads, fighter planes soared into the sky. 10, 12, 13, 14. Paula shouted, pointing at the Focke-Wulfs, flying over our heads. "Good luck to our pilots." "Let's go, guys," I shouted. "Let's go," Paula repeated. "It's light now, they'll be able to see everything. 22, 23, 24, how many of them?" 30 fighters launched. Their tactic was to climb as high into the sky as possible, and from there strike the enemy bombers in the rear. From afar came the firing of anti-aircraft guns. "If we manage to intercept them here, on the approach, they will not reach Berlin," said Paula. "I hope so, Paula." I'd forgotten all about the raid, for crying out loud. That's why I let go of the girl's hand, deciding that the fighters would know what to do. I approached Paula again, but then the roar of the enemy bombers drowned out the sounds of the airfield. "Look, Gil," Paula said, mispronouncing my name as usual. "They're coming from over there?" With a frail hand, she pointed to the multitude of black spots in the pale blue sky, which were getting bigger and bigger by the second. "How many are there?" she shouted. "Look, there are more flying over there." I watched the hordes of airplanes coming at the city, and at us from both sides. The noise of the engines grew louder and louder. There must be hundreds of them. I was afraid. For us, for her, for my happiness. We have to get out of here, Paula. It's getting too dangerous. Oh, come on. Paula wasn't scared at all. What could happen to us? What if they start bombing us too? We have to find shelter. I tried to pull her with me. Look, she was mesmerized by the sight of approaching danger. They're coming straight for us. The anti-aircraft guns from the city have started firing at the bombers. Okay, come on, hurry up. I grabbed Paula's arm. Take cover. We can't run to the bomb shelters on the airfield. I pulled Paula toward a ravine near a big tree. But where are our fighters? She was panting. They must have run away. The enemy's superiority is too great. How can you say that? German fighters are not cowards. There's nothing left for them, Paula. There are at least 1,000 bombers against them. You have no right to talk about our heroes like that. I'm sorry, Paula. I can't even imagine them escaping. The sound of bombardment was again heard over the city. German soldiers don't run away, that's true. But who better to know about it than the Don to Kharkov? True, it must be admitted, the Germans fought bravely against the superior forces of the enemy. It was the same in Russia. From the ravine we watched the city being bombed. The third part of the airfield and almost the whole Tempelhof were also hit. During the day, the raids were carried out with even greater ferocity than at night. That day, Berlin and the surrounding area bombed 1,000 and more Anglo-American planes. They were opposed by only 60 fighters, but a main blow to the enemy struck our anti-aircraft artillery. At least 100 aircraft were shot down. Our fighter pilots really did not chicken out, but they also got a hard time. And now, as if in reality, I hear the whistling sound of the bombs. From a height of 7,000 or 8,000 feet fell on Tempelhof and the airfield. Feel how the ground shakes under their blows. I see the craters made by the bombs, burning houses, clouds of smoke rising several hundred meters into the sky from the oil storage tanks where the fire began. I watch the smoke descend on the inhabitants of the suburbs. Wide-eyed with horror, I watch as the hurricane rips 10 to 12 trees out of the ground at once. I hear the engines of downed airplanes roaring, see them lose altitude, explode, and fall. I can also see the terror in Paula's eyes, clinging to me. All around us everything is burning and collapsing. We hid at the bottom of the ravine, huddled together. Paula hid her face between my shoulder and cheek. I could feel her trembling, and the ground shook with her. We, frightened as if we were little children, watched what was happening, unable to move. Even after the bombardment had ceased, which had claimed 22,000 lives, the explosions of time bombs were still heard in Tempelhof. Berlin was no less affected. The ordinary life of the capital was completely paralyzed. The fire continued in Spandau, and bombs were still exploding in the southwest of the city, even after 15 hours. It seemed that Tempelhof no longer existed. Unable to remember our horror, we got out of the shelter. Paula did not let go of my hand and trembled continuously. "Gil," she said, "what a horror. Look at me. I'm covered in mud." Her head rested on my shoulder. Without even thinking, I kissed her forehead. She didn't resist. I wasn't afraid to kiss my lover. We were past the half-childish games. I kissed her hair as one kisses a frightened child. Her tears reminded me of the cries of the boy from Magdeburg. I thought of Ernst, too, of all the sobs and pain experienced in the war. I'd experienced pity and was showing it. My happiness was too mixed with the pain. I could not accept it and forget the rest. In the incessant chaos, my love for Paula seemed impossible. As long as there were children crying in destroyed homes, I could not live with my beloved. Nothing is certain. Maybe I am not destined to live through this wonderful summer day. Only my love for Paula will remain, and I don't even know how to say it. Temple sky was covered with smoke. Tempelhof was burning, the roads, Berlin. I looked from Paula's blonde hair to the destruction around me. She fell to the ground again. I didn't know how to comfort her. After gathering our strength, we slowly made our way to the road where the rescue trucks were travelling toward Tempelhof. Without signalling, a truck stopped next to us. "Get in, young people. We need your help." We looked at each other. "Yes, let's go." Paula, I'll help you." The rescuers were taking everyone they met along the way. They decided to leave one part of the city to its fate and save another. For hours we worked in the ruins, pulling out the wounded. In the most dangerous places a Hitler Youth Squad operated. Many of the volunteers died being buried under the collapsed buildings. My eyes were still obscured by smoke, and I kept seeing images of what had happened. When darkness fell, we went into the dilapidated house. Paula took hold of a button on my dirty tunic. "Do you think we can sleep here?" she asked. "Who knows? Anyway, we might be discovered. There'll be trouble." What was she thinking? "I don't care. I'm too tired." Paula, licking her wounded finger, didn't say anything. I was ready to fight God or the devil. I embraced her and kissed her passionately. Her hands stroked my hair. We wanted to return what we had failed to accomplish during the day, but fatigue took its toll, and we fell into sleep. The whole of the next day was spent in rescue work. It took a week to get the city more or less back to normal. By evening, however, we had been replaced by a new group of volunteers. Fortunately, I wasn't given any special assignments. 2 more days passed. I never left Paula's side. Every day I brought a new batch of chocolate and cigarettes from the parcel my father had brought me. The city was licking its wounds and burying the dead. Long funeral processions stretched through the streets. But everything was already returning to its normal rhythm. I had 5 days left. Paula did her best to distract me. Fortunately, there were no more raids. The Newbucks had broken windows and destroyed the roof, 150 yards away in the square. Bombsville, it now resembled a street in Minsk. Paula's mother, whom I met, had her suspicions. After all, her daughter and I had never parted during the day or evening. But she understood the times in which we lived and did not protest much. One day Paula, who had more money than me, took me to the movies. We saw the movie The Immense Sea, which was based on a poem about water lilies. That's how we lived until my last day in Berlin. I was to arrive at the Silesian train station at 7 o'clock in the evening. Our farewell to the Newbucks was touching. They understood that I wanted to spend the remaining time with my beloved. Frau Newbuck persuaded me to take the warm pullover that Ernst had once worn. Her husband gave me cigars, soap, and 2 boxes of canned goods. They hugged me and made me promise that during my next vacation I would visit them. I would send them word from time to time. For my part, I asked them to take care of Paula. "You love her, don't you?" Mrs. Newbuck asked me. "Of course, Mrs. Newbuck." I tried to say these words calmly, but my feelings were ready to burst out. I kissed them and left. Felfbill allowed Paula to go to the barracks and help me pack my belongings. My throat clenched with grief. How long would it be before I saw Paula again? We kept repeating how much we loved each other, and we felt a little better. In 3 or 4 months I would probably be given another vacation, and Paula would be waiting for me, of course. She swore that she would write to me every day, that very soon we would belong to each other, that we would be married. Her lips during the kisses repeated these words to me 1,000 times. "The war will soon be o'er. It can't go on like this. We can't endure a winter like last year. Everyone had had enough. The fighting would have to stop. We were sure of that." We got to the Silesian railway station, and here we learned that, because of the bombing, the platform where the train was leaving had been moved half a kilometre away. Paula walked beside me, smiling in spite of her feelings. She was carrying a last-minute gift that she wanted to give away. On the platform were banners in honour of soldiers returning to the Eastern Front. We stopped in front of the first car of the train to Poznan. I adjusted my satchel and turned around to see Paula's desperate face. "Don't be sad, my love. I love you so much." I stood like that for a long time without letting go of her hands, unable to say anything. I would have liked to hug her, but it was forbidden in public places. People were passing by. On the cement-covered platform, the footsteps of soldiers could be heard. The world disappeared for me, only Paula remained. It was time for departure. A shiver ran through my body and my fingers twitched. An attendant in a red cap walked along the platform and announced the stations. Poznan, Warsaw, Lublin, Lvov, Russia. These words finished me. I could hardly gather my courage. Paula. The railroader continued to name the distant points to which the train was headed. "Nothing to do, you mate. Paula, how will I live without you?" "Goodbye, my love," Paula whispered. Tears were rolling down her face. "Paula, please, Noddy Tui, I don't cry. I beg you, I know I'll be back soon." "I know, my love. Goodbye, Gil. A platoon of soldiers sang at the top of their lungs on the other platform. Erica, we love you. Erica, we love you. That's why we came back. That's why we came back. Listen, Paula, even the song talks about coming back. Listen to me. My feelings were suffocating me. I'll come back. I'll come back because Paula's waiting for me. That's what the song is about. And then the departure signal sounded. It's over. I pulled Paula to me and hugged her as hard as I could. No, take your seats. Hurry up. Hurry up. Those leaving, take your seats on the train. Attention, passengers, take your seats. I love you, Paula. I'll see you soon. Don't cry. Look, it's a beautiful day. You can't cry on a day like this. But Paula was inconsolable. I was ready to burst into tears myself. The train cars jerked. I jumped on the step. Paula waved. The people on the platform were crying. Soldiers leaned out of the cars. As the train picked up speed, Paula ran, but eventually she fell behind. I'll see you soon, my love. It was such a beautiful day. You would have thought we were going on a picnic. For a long time I stood on the step and watched the silhouette of my beloved diminish. At last it was gone, gone forever. I'll be back. But I never came back. I never saw Paula Berlin, the clearing Strasse and the new bucks again. The war prevented me from fulfilling my promise, and when peace came, it lost its value. France cruelly reminds me of that. Forgive me, Paula. I'm not the only one to blame. You've experienced the sorrows of war, the fear, the pain. Maybe you survived too. I wish with all my heart that you had. Then you'll remember me too. The war has done away with Berlin, with Germany, with the Clearingstrasse, perhaps with the Newbacks, but not with you, Paula, not with you. That would be too much. I have forgotten nothing. Closing my eyes, I recall the moments we spent together. I hear your voice again, smell your skin, and hold your hand in mine.